The Financial Times recently published an investigation with a very heavy title. They called the UAE's activities in Africa an imperial push, not partnership, not investment, imperial. That is the kind of language Western media usually reserves for global powers, and now they have directed it at a small but extremely wealthy Gulf state. But if you look closely at the full picture, this story is not simply about a media campaign against Abu Dhabi. It raises a much larger question about power, sovereignty, and who really controls Africa's strategic trade routes and resources. This video will not defend the UAE, and it will not condemn them easily either. Instead, we will examine three key questions. First, what exactly did the Financial Times document? Second, when does commercial investment turn into geopolitical power? And third, why African countries that possess the same resources as the UAE have failed to do the same thing. If you want to understand how power actually operates in Africa, follow the Sahel lens. We analyze based on evidence, not slogans. The Financial Times investigation, published in early August, was part of a wider series about the rise of the UAE as a global power. The series has looked at Abu Dhabi's influence in Washington, its role in global shipping lanes, and now its expansion into Africa. The important thing to understand is that the real focus of the Financial Times was not Africa. The real focus was the UAE. Africa is simply the place where that transformation is easiest to observe. And that itself says a lot about how the world views this continent. On the numbers, the Financial Times cited data showing more than $168 billion in UAE-linked projects announced in Africa since 2017. That is a massive figure, but it must be read carefully. Announced is not the same as spent, it is not the same as completed, and it is not the same as operational. For their part, UAE officials say they committed more than $110 billion to African projects between 2019 and 2023. Roughly $70 billion of that is connected to renewable energy and green development. These figures measure different periods, but they point to the same basic conclusion. The UAE has become one of the most influential foreign investors in Africa. But the real structure of power is not in the total amount of money. It is in where that money is being directed. And here, the picture becomes clearer. First, ports. DP World and Abu Dhabi ports are operating or developing ports, inland terminals, and free zones across roughly 13 African countries. The most strategic asset is the port of Berbera in Somaliland, where DP World holds a long-term concession and has committed more than $440 million. Berbera is not just a dock. It connects to a trade corridor toward Ethiopia and sits near the approaches to the Red Sea, one of the most important shipping choke points in the world. A port by itself is a commercial asset, but when a port connects to a road, it becomes a corridor. When it connects to a free trade zone, it creates commercial dependence. And when it combines with security arrangements, it becomes geopolitical leverage. The same asset starts doing several jobs at once. That is the model being deployed. Second, minerals. An Abu Dhabi-linked company, International Resources Holding, acquired 51% of Zambia's Mopani copper mines and committed over $1 billion to expand operations. Copper is the metal of electrification. Whoever controls copper supply chains holds a card in the global energy transition. Third, and most importantly, gold. Research from Chatham House found that in 2022, Africa supplied roughly 58% of all gold imported into the UAE. For years, there has been a massive gap between the gold African countries officially declared for export and the gold recorded arriving in the UAE. In 2024 alone, the UAE imported around 1,400 tons of gold, worth more than $100 billion. More than half of it came from Africa. Sudan provides a sharp example. In 2024, Sudan sold the UAE 29 tons of gold, up from 17 tons the year before. This happened in the middle of a full-scale civil war. Gold left the war zone, arrived in Dubai, and entered the global market. That is a clearly documented financial route, and it raises serious questions about responsibility. On the security side, Researchers at Carnegie have documented UAE-linked military facilities or access arrangements in or around Eritrea, Somaliland, Puntland, Chad, Libya, and Egypt. These are not American-style bases with tens of thousands of soldiers. They are flexible outposts, an airstrip here, a port arrangement there, a training mission, and a lot of local partners. It is a very modern way of projecting power, and it is cheap to build because Africa has too many governance gaps. The official UAE response is notable, not because it denies the transactions, but because of how it frames the debate. Afra Al-Hameli, the Director of Strategic Communications at the UAE Foreign Ministry, published a direct rebuttal in the Financial Times. She argued that calling these partnerships imperial ambition is deeply patronizing because it relies on an outdated narrative that portrays African countries as passive recipients of foreign influence, incapable of identifying their own national interests. To a certain extent, that argument has value. An African government signing an agreement with DP World is not the same as a colonial army seizing a port. These deals were negotiated sovereignly. There was no gun on the table. And it is true that Western media often only focuses on Africa when another foreign power enters the picture. China was described as taking over Africa. Russia was described as taking over Africa. Turkey too. Now it is the UAE. In these stories, the foreign power is always the actor, and Africa is always the object being acted upon. That criticism is valid, but the matter does not end there. The consent of a government only explains how a relationship begins. It does not tell you who benefits from that relationship over time. A minister can negotiate badly. An indebted government can accept terms that create long-term dependence. A small political elite can profit from a contract while the country carries the risk. A corrupt contract remains a corrupt contract even if an African government signed it. So the central question is not whether Africa agreed to these deals. The central question is whether those deals serve the people of Africa. 3 countries help answer that question. Start with Mali. In mid-2025, a United Nations monitoring report traced a ransom of about $50 million paid for one hostage held in Mali. The report said most of that money was later distributed among the fighting units of an armed coalition and played a role in financing attacks across Mali. Reuters, citing regional sources, identified the UAE as the country that paid the ransom. Abu Dhabi has neither confirmed nor denied it. The important distinction here is that the UN report did not name the UAE. The attribution came from media sources. That difference matters and must be respected. However, regardless of who paid, the consequences remain. Money entered a conflict zone and was used to continue a war. The question Mali raises is this: when outside money enters an African conflict, who carries responsibility for what that money does afterwards? That question has not been answered. The second case is Sudan, and it is the heaviest. Since April 2023, the Sudanese army has been fighting the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by Hemedti. The Sudanese government has repeatedly accused the UAE of supplying the RSF with weapons, money, and logistics. The UAE denies all of it. But the evidence does not only come from Khartoum. Reuters documented suspicious flight patterns through Chad, near the Sudanese border. Investigators identified Chinese-made guided bombs used by the RSF and concluded they were almost certainly re-exported through the UAE. They also documented UAE-manufactured armored vehicles in RSF hands. More recently, Reuters reported on a draft UN investigation into an aircraft network moving weapons, drones, and foreign fighters to the RSF. Abu Dhabi denies everything and says its own investigations found nothing. Sudan took the UAE to the International Court of Justice, accusing it of complicity in genocide against the Masalit people through support for the RSF. The court dismissed the case in May. But there is an important detail that often gets lost. The court did not examine the evidence and declare the UAE innocent. It dismissed the case because it had no jurisdiction, due to a reservation the UAE placed on the Genocide Convention. So anyone who says the ICJ cleared the UAE is not describing the event accurately. The evidence was never examined on its substance. Beneath the war story is the flow of gold. Before the conflict began, Hemeti and his family network built enormous wealth from Sudanese gold. Dubai has long been one of his principal destinations. Gold leaves Sudan, money enters armed networks, weapons return to Sudan. Control of mining territory becomes more valuable. More gold leaves. The UAE insists it is not part of that illegal supply chain. But investigators keep finding the same country at both ends of the story. The market for the gold at one end, and the alleged supply lines for weapons at the other. That convergence has not been explained by any press release. The third case is Somalia, but its nature is different from Sudan. The Somalia story is about sovereignty. The UAE built deep relationships with Somaliland, Puntland, and other regional authorities, while also dealing with the federal government in Mogadishu. In mid-January, the Somali government cancelled all of its agreements with the UAE, including the ports of Berbera, Bosaso, and Kismayo, as well as security and defense cooperation. Mogadishu said Emirati actions were undermining Somalia's sovereignty, national unity, and political independence. The context matters. Israel had recently recognized Somaliland, and the UAE was widely seen as quietly supportive. Somaliland responded by calling the UAE a trusted friend and ally. Puntland called Mogadishu's decision illegal. The result is a country being pulled apart along the lines of who signed what with Abu Dhabi. If these were only commercial container terminals, why did an African government conclude that its survival as a unified state was at risk? That is the question the Somalia case forces us to face. For balance, look at Zambia. When Emirati money bought 51% of Mopani, it rescued a struggling mine, protected jobs, and promised expansion. Rejecting that capital, simply because it came from the UAE, would be irrational. The right response is not to reject the money. The right response is to scrutinize how it is used. Who owns the reserves? Where is the copper processed? Where are the trading margins captured? What percentage of the value stays in Zambia? Those questions should be asked of every investor, regardless of nationality. So is the UAE building an empire in Africa? If empire means conquering territory, appointing governors and ruling populations, then no. Using that word carelessly insults the memory of actual colonialism. But if empire means a network of ports, capital, minerals and security relationships reinforcing each other until a small Gulf state gains enormous influence over African trade routes, resources, and political decisions, then the Financial Times has raised a question that cannot be ignored. The more precise term is networked power. Influence becomes power on the day the other party can no longer afford to say no. And that is where the real discomfort of this story appears. The UAE spent decades converting oil into everything oil is not. They converted it into ports, airlines, logistics networks, a financial center, a global gold hub, and sovereign wealth funds. They prepared for the world after oil while they were still pumping it. Meanwhile, what did African oil producers do with the same resource? Nigeria has produced oil for more than half a century. Where did that wealth go? Where is the Nigerian Sovereign Fund reshaping trade corridors in West Africa? Where is the African version of a global logistics hub? Senegal, Namibia, and Uganda are about to join the club of new oil producers. Will they copy Abu Dhabi's playbook, or will they repeat the old model of converting resources into consumption instead of leverage? The UAE did not become powerful because of some special quality that Africans lack. The UAE became powerful because it did something with oil that many African states refused to do. It turned a finite resource into long-term structural power. If a country of 11 million people can be accused of building an empire over a continent of more than 1.4 billion people, then the real scandal is not only in Abu Dhabi, it is in African capitals, where resources were turned into short-term consumption instead of lasting influence. That does not absolve the UAE. No country seeking advantage in Africa should be automatically trusted simply because it is not Western. And no country should be automatically distrusted simply because it is Western. The standard must be the same for everyone. When any foreign partner arrives with billions of dollars, African governments should ask 4 questions. Who owns the asset when the agreement ends? Who controls strategic decisions while the project is running? Where do the profits go? And can the African country still say no without being punished? The day the answer to that question is no, investment has crossed the line into power. The biggest lesson from this story is not the UAE. The biggest lesson is Africa's negotiating capacity. Every contract must be read in terms of 10 years from now, 20 years from now, not just the current election cycle. A government signs a bad deal today and leaves office next year, but the nation lives with the consequences for decades. So the final question for you is this. When you look at deals like the Berbera port, the Mopani mine, or the Sudanese gold routes, what do you see? An investment model that can help Africa develop, or a power network that is gradually tightening its grip over the continent's trade routes and resources? And more importantly, among Africa's current oil and mineral producers, which country has the real ability to learn from the UAE model and turn its resources into structural power within the next 20 years? Leave your answer in the comment section. If you want to continue following evidence-based geopolitical analysis on the Sahel and the wider continent, subscribe to the Sahel Lens and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.